Chapter 31, Chapter 31. Chapter 31, Like Father, Like Son. Ash cleared his throat and took a shaking step forward, only now remembering the fatigue eating away at his legs. His eyes quickly roamed over the contingent of trainers and flighted monsters before him, before coming to rest on the man claiming to be Giovanni.
"What are you doing here?"
Ash asked, unsure of what else to say.
"My job,"
Giovanni stated flatly, the long coat hanging over his shoulders beginning to flap about, revealing the plates of grey armor hanging around his body as a hot wind picked up from the west.
"I'm here on business."
Ash grimaced and took another pace forward.
"And what exactly is your job?"
His tone grew acier.
"If it's making my life as fucking miserable as possible, congratulations. I'm not here to fight you."
Giovanni raised his hands to his sides.
"I just want to talk." "Fight you?"
Ash growled.
"I should do a lot more than that. I should."
The young gym leader's briefly dormant anger began to reawaken, only to die down again when Ash noted just how many armed trainers surrounded Giovanni.
"Probably avoid doing anything stupid." "Before anyone does anything,"
May broke in, stepping beside Ash as several of the mounted trainers shifted in their saddles.
"Maybe we should all go somewhere more comfortable, then decide if we want to kill each other."
She trailed off as several hard looks fell on her.
"Maybe."
Again, she glanced around at the small army of trainers and monsters.
"Ash,"
Giovanni's tone dropped again.
"I'm sorry we had to meet under these circumstances after everything that's happened, but I can explain."
The man's face grew tense and he folded his hands behind his back.
"Please,"
he went on.
"I'm only asking for a chance to talk."
Ash remained silent for a moment, either unaware or unconcerned with the numerous pairs of eyes warily watching his every move as he glared at Giovanni. The young trainer shifted and started to open his mouth as if to say something, but a movement from within the crowd of trainers silenced him. From within the ranks of soldiers in red and black stepped a man in a white coat. Putting some distance between himself and the numerous beasts at his flanks, perfectly bald head catching a glint of sunlight, the man sniffed through his white toothbrush mustache and stepped up next to Giovanni.
"If you two are quite done,"
the man in the lab coat grunted, the skin above his opaque black glasses crinkling and betraying a frown,
"or even if you're not, we shouldn't linger here. Someone's yet to inform the Jotans they've lost, so there might be more about."
He stopped and turned on Ash.
"I'm going to my gym and you are all welcome to join me." "Blaine."
Ash prodded for clarification.
"It's good to know you're—" Yes,
the bald gym leader cut Ash short, not a hint of amusement or amicability in his tone.
"I know you're here only for my research and my name for your crusade, so don't feign concern. Away with us. This day's dragged on far long enough."
He turned and walked back towards the crowd. Somewhat stunned, Ash shook his head and collected himself as Blaine slung one leg over a Charizard.
"Well,"
the young gym leader muttered.
"That was abrupt. Is he always like that?"
He turned reflexively to Giovanni with the question, only an instant thereafter consciously recoiling from the man.
"Pretty much,"
said the man in the suit, turning back to his son.
"Listen, I really don't mean—"
He trailed off, face again filling with uncertainty.
"Hey,"
Ash looked away, put his hand to the radio at his ear, and waited for Janine to respond before he went on.
"Meet us back at the fort in the mountain. I found Blaine. He's intact."
He paused and grinned at the girl's response.
"See you there,"
he said, features lightening greatly.
"Out."
Ash let his hand drop back to his side and faced Giovanni, eyes instantly going hard again.
"You're lucky. I'm done starting fights today,"
he stated flatly.
"We'll talk at the gym, but I'm not promising anything."
The gym leader in the suit reached up and smoothed his thick hair back with the palm of his hand. He simply nodded to Ash, then looked to May.
"The name's Giovanni Ketchum, and you must be Norman's daughter, May."
He inclined his head politely and pressed his hat to his chest.
"It's a pleasure to meet you under such pleasant circumstances."
Clearing her throat, May extended her hand and shook Giovanni's.
"Team Rocket's leader,"
she grinned.
"I'd heard quite a bit about your organization even before coming to the mainland. I understand you have quite a lot of resources at your disposal."
She smirked.
said
the man in the suit, a little grin on his lip.
"Now spent, mostly. Ill-gotten, mostly,"
Ash chimed in under his breath and scowled.
"Well,"
May crossed her arms,
"for a while now I've been planning on returning to Hoenn and reclaiming my family's fortunes. Maybe you and I can make an arrangement."
Ash put his hand over his face. Shouting from the gathering of trainers to get everyone's attention, Blaine waved at Giovanni.
Hey. I'm leaving, now.
Giovanni sighed and shook his head.
We can all talk back at the gym,
he said, looking between Ash and May.
There's a lot of ground to cover.
Returning to his Pokémon, Ash quickly ran his hands through Arcanine's mane, scratching the energetic dog behind his ears and thanking him for all his work. After going through his Pokémon and thanking each in turn, Ash returned all but Charizard to their Pokéballs and jumped into the dragon's saddle as May mounted a blue Swellow and strapped herself into the saddle. Giovanni returned to the trainers waiting for him and climbed atop the Aerodactyl.
So that's your dad,
May prodded as Giovanni and Team Rocket's soldiers took to the skies in a flurry of dust.
I guess,
Ash growled as he took Charizard's reins in one hand and hefted his black helmet with the other. May turned in her saddle to look at Ash as the young gym leader hesitated.
Aren't you excited to meet him? Why should I be?
Ash answered, watching as the flying beasts shrank into the orange sky before disappearing into the sooty clouds hanging over the gym and trenches.
All he's ever been to me is an enemy. The way I understand it, people like us,
May gestured between herself and Ash,
we tend to just understand each other. I don't have any bad feelings about the man.
She nodded towards the distance.
How do you know he's like us?
Ash didn't look at her.
You mean you can't feel it?
Asked the girl in the armor.
No,
Ash shook his head.
I definitely felt it. So there you have it. Besides,
May continued,
he's your dad. If I had a chance to talk to mine. Fucking my mom doesn't make him my father,
Ash barked. He shoved his helmet down over his head, kicking his heels into Charizard's sides and spurring the dragon to charge forward with a roar and leap into the air. Sucking in a breath as May followed after him, Ash turned and looked towards the ground. Immediately, he spotted the shallow crater where his grandfather's body lay.
Damn it!
Ash swore under his breath, head beginning to spin.
Damn it all!
Straining against the urge to go and pay some kind of last respect to his grandfather, Ash made himself decide he saw no reason to return to bury the body. The burning ache left in his chest by the decision did little to blot out the growing anxiety building over the imminent conversation with Giovanni. Rising high on an updraft and weaving around the plumes of smoke rising from the battlefields, Ash, May, and the other trainers sped for the gym. Blaine, leading the procession, guided his mount towards the mouth of the volcano which, Ash saw as he neared, had built into its structure a yawning cave mouth that led into an expansive chamber. Flying into the man-made cave, the flock of mounted trainers came grinding to a halt in a cavern that bore a great number of smaller caves dotting its walls. Here and there Ash saw a few other trainers flying to and from the many caves within the rookery. Spotting a flicker of movement from the corner of the rookery, Ash jumped eagerly down from Charizard, just in time to catch Janine in a bear hug and spin her around once as she launched herself at him.
Miss me?
Ash asked, regaining some semblance of balance. Janine nodded.
As you are guests,
Blaine called out, hopping down from his Charizard,
should you wish to keep your Pokémon here and not in their Pokéballs, feel free to do so. Many creatures prefer the openness of the roosts, so make yourselves at home. You three.
The man with the mustache gestured harshly between Giovanni, Ash, and Janine.
I believe we have matters you'll sooner or later insist on discussing. Shall we pull that tooth now or would you prefer to rest?
Janine turned sharply towards the bald scientist, studying him for a second as Ash let her go.
Now would be good.
She looked between Ash and Blaine, only then spotting the man in the pinstripe suit, her eyes instantly going cold as her brow furrowed into a frown.
Easy,
Ash put his hand on her arm, his voice barely above a whisper.
I said I'd give him a chance to talk. That's Giovanni,
Janine breathed, not taking her eyes off the tall man.
He'll know where Koga is hiding.
Her face hardened.
Just let me beat. We're surrounded.
Ash's grip tightened as he hissed in the girl's ear.
Save it for when we wouldn't instantly die.
Politely freeing her arm from Ash's grip, Janine sighed.
Fine,
she muttered.
You're right. Sorry. I had the same thought, believe me,
Ash whispered, looking over at his father as the man in the suit casually conversed with May.
Schweigen.
Blaine barked, startling everyone present, save Giovanni. He turned around with a flare of his coat and shoved his hands in his pockets as he walked.
Jabbering like old women. Disgraceful. I'll be in my laboratory if any of you care to discuss real business. Old dogs,
Giovanni smiled, turning back to May. He took her hand and kissed the backs of her fingers.
Begging your pardon, but Blaine's not a patient man. We can discuss your future with Team Rocket as soon as I'm done.
From a distance, Ash shook his head.
Of course,
May nodded, putting one hand behind her head and blushing brightly.
Sure thing. Just, whenever. I'll find somewhere to hang out.
Giovanni turned and walked towards Ash and Janine, prompting both trainers to face him directly and stiffen. He took his hat in one hand and tipped it towards them.
Shall we?
He asked,
before Blaine's good humor runs out.
Ash nodded without answering as Janine hooked her arm around his elbow. The young trainer's eyes narrowed as he studied the man in the suit, tracking Giovanni as he walked past the two trainers and followed behind Blaine. Without a word, Ash and Janine turned and kept pace, following the other men through a wide hall carved from dark stone and lit by windows set high in the towering walls.
Look at that,
Janine muttered, pulling Ash's arm a little and looking up. As he walked, Ash's eyes followed Janine's gaze up the walls, and after a moment of searching and trying to interpret what he saw, Ash's mouth dropped open a little.
Wow,
he muttered. Flat, featureless walls rose perhaps 90 to 100 feet over Ash's head before narrow but enormously tall windows broke the flat surfaces. At that point, buttresses and supports crisscrossed the upper reaches of the massive chamber, made from the same dark stone as the walls and illuminated by the amber light flooding in through the windows. Only then did Ash realize that he couldn't see the ceiling for the orange haze lingering around the windows.
Those are clouds,
Ash said, no small amount of wonder in his tone as he watched the amber haze drift lazily from one side of the upper reaches to the other and flow out the opposite windows.
There are clouds up there. This way,
Janine whispered, tugging Ash's arm to get him back on course as he walked with his head up. The pair turned to follow Giovanni and Blaine down a side corridor and into a tall tower whose hollow center's inner wall sported a wide stairwell spiraling downwards. The stairwell's only illumination came from a skylight overhead, leaving much of the tower plunged in shadows.
Watch your step,
Giovanni said, turning back to the two younger trainers as the group reached a landing and passed under an arch into a corridor lined with side halls and doors.
Touch nothing,
Blaine grumbled, pausing in the middle of the hall and addressing the three trainers behind him.
At any given second, a dozen things could go wrong in this lab, with the end result being a massacre. Understand?
Glancing around the hall, and trying to see through what few doors were even cracked open, Ash quickly surmised that, given the size of the locks and counterbalanced closing mechanisms on the heavy metal doors all around, this entire corridor was designed to be locked down at a moment's notice. Glancing into the spacious cells beyond the doors, Ash mentally noted their contents, which ranged from operating tables to counters piled high with tubes of glowing fluid. Here and there, men and women in white coats darted about with clipboards or lab equipment in hand. Following the bald gym leader's instructions, Ash, Janine, and Giovanni entered a comfortably furnished conference room with a large round table in the center, an electric chandelier overhead, and a large computer monitor on the wall opposite the door. Pulling a chair for Janine before sitting next to her, Ash watched as Giovanni took a seat a few spaces away and Blaine sat opposite them all.
Now then,
Blaine adjusted his glasses and sniffed sharply through his mustache.
I've had enough pussyfooting around and so,
he turned to Giovanni.
I believe we had a deal.
Pulling open his jacket, Giovanni produced a somewhat crumpled manila envelope.
All of our notes and observations,
he gestured with the envelope and set it on the table.
There's also my own recommendations.
A flick of his wrist sent the envelope spinning across the table where Blaine snatched it up and ripped open the top.
Your thoughts are superfluous at best.
Blaine removed several papers and photographs from the envelope, quickly studying them as he spoke.
Has his degeneration at all affected his ability to control the thralls?
Giovanni shook his head.
Not in the least,
he said, smoothing back his hair and sighing.
It's only his body that's withering, and even then he's fine as long as he doesn't exert himself. His telesthetic signature is growing exponentially. If that's any indicator of his current power.
He trailed off and cleared his throat.
We've concluded that he could control thralls as far away as the Orange Islands without any great effort.
Blaine looked up from the papers he held in both hands.
Well, that's not good,
the gym leader stated flatly.
So you detected theta waves in the Orange Islands? And in Sinnoh,
Giovanni added. Blaine's jaw tightened.
Under different circumstances I might be proud.
Ash cleared his throat.
This is all wonderfully vague and secretive, but I don't think we have time for that. Who are you both talking about, exactly?
He asked abruptly. Giovanni sucked in a breath.
Oh boy,
he muttered, looking at Blaine. The bald gym leader began tapping his finger on the wooden table, his mustache twitching like a living animal as Blaine's lip curled in a grimace.
You are here that I may quickly switch between conversations,
said the gym leader, glaring at the young trainer through his glasses.
Not to participate in all of the discussions.
Ash raised an eyebrow but decided not to speak, simply sitting back in the comfortable chair. A moment later Janine patted his arm.
I think,
Giovanni began,
that Ash should be privy to a certain level of information.
He turned and looked at the young gym leader.
So you're aware, it's a creature called Mewtwo that we've been discussing.
He paused when he saw surprise dawn on Ash's face.
I believe you've made his acquaintance.
Ash nodded instinctively before recovering.
Yeah,
he frowned.
He was helping me dismantle Team Rocket. Humph.
Blaine tossed the papers in his hands to the table.
I'll bet he was, and I'll bet you just leapt to his aid. What's that supposed to mean?
Ash asked, folding his arms in front of his chest.
Ash,
Giovanni said, no small amount of caution in his tone.
Mewtwo's fighting Team Rocket because right now it's the only thing keeping him contained in Cerulean Cave. If not for my efforts, he'd have destroyed half of Kanto by now. Bullshit,
Ash shook his head.
From what I've seen.
He smiled mockingly.
You're the biggest threat to Kanto. Team Rocket's responsible for everything from wiping out Lavender to completely impoverishing Vermilion to, trying to kill me. You'll have to forgive me for not buying that the guy who saved me, from you.
He again nodded to Giovanni.
Is actually the bad guy. Lavender and Vermilion were small sacrifices made for the greater good.
Giovanni looked down at the table.
Me too, hey.
Ash asked.
Killing me is for the greater good too, I take it. If you would let me explain. So you can lie. May I speak?
Barked the man in the suit. Blaine groaned and slapped one hand on the table.
For God's sake,
he rubbed his forehead with 2 fingers.
If you two are going to bicker, go do it somewhere else so I can at least get something productive accomplished.
He gathered the loose papers around him and stood up.
Excuse me, sir,
Janine said quietly, raising her hand a little.
I hate to impose, but...
She trailed off. Another sigh escaped Blaine and he readjusted his black glasses.
It almost slipped my mind.
He stopped and looked at Giovanni.
The time for secrecy has ended. Mewtwo is beyond containment. It's time we involve the Elite Four, so while I'm busy with medical matters, you should send someone to contact Lance. I sent the messenger a week ago,
said the man in the suit, shaking his head,
asking for a meeting in Saffron. We'll have Lance's response any time now. Well, that's some of the best news I've heard today,
Blaine nodded.
Now, as for you.
He looked to Janine.
If you'll follow me, we can discuss certain medical matters in private.
Janine looked at Ash, then back at Blaine and nodded, standing up. As Ash got to his feet beside her, Blaine cleared his throat.
In private,
the older man scowled.
The last time I let someone from your family involve themselves in my research, it got us into the mess we're in now.
Making a face, Giovanni silently mocked Blaine's words.
I don't think,
Ash started, stopping when Janine put her hand on his arm.
It'll be fine,
she said with a grin.
You should rest up.
She smiled at him.
Today.
Blaine prodded, starting for the door with the papers and envelope in his hand. Pausing for a second, Ash looked over at Giovanni and then back at Janine.
I'll find something to keep myself busy.
He kissed her cheek and let go of her hand as she turned and followed Blaine out of the room. Taking a breath, Ash walked around the table and sat opposite a silent Giovanni. Well beyond arm's reach, but close enough to speak without raising their voices, both men waited and eyed each other until the door closed behind Janine. Even then, the silence in the room remained unbroken for what felt like a very long time. So, Ash said at length, folding his hands on the table and staring across the table at his father.
I promised we'd talk. Mostly because I want to know what I did to piss you off. Care to fill me in? So now you're actually willing to let me speak?
The man in the suit raised an eyebrow.
What changed? All this talk about Mewtwo and the Elite Four,
said Ash.
My curiosity outweighs my spitefulness. Besides,
May's words from earlier that day came to his mind, sticking in the back of his head and inflaming a sudden feeling of guilt he couldn't override.
There's no reason we can't be civil.
Giovanni shrugged. After taking a steadying breath, the tall man leaned back in his chair and sat one hand on his knee.
In that case, would you believe me if I said I thought you died when Pallet was destroyed?
He asked.
And that circumstances didn't allow me to act as I wanted even after I learned otherwise.
Ash's eyes narrowed.
I'd be willing to listen to your side of the story.
His stomach tightened as he sensed a sudden change in the atmosphere. The calm composure he felt emanating from Giovanni melted, and the young trainer felt a sudden and withering anxiety that mirrored the turmoil that flitted across Giovanni's face. He shook himself once, but the feeling stuck. Looking up, his features again collected, Giovanni met Ash's eye with a resigned steadiness.
When Elm attacked Pallet, I was working in...
He stopped short.
No.
He said after a quick pause.
Let me back up. You don't mind if I start at the beginning?
Shrugging his shoulders, Ash sank into his chair a little.
Jesse and James spent more than a year trying to kill me. They killed Misty. Team Rocket sapped Vermilion dry, blood Fuchsia into submission, obliterated what was left of Lavender, and tried to take over Celadon. I imagine that's going to take quite a bit of explaining, and I've got nothing better to do.
Fine, Giovanni said, his tone calm again, even as uncertainty gnawed at Ash's stomach. The man in the suit pulled up his sleeve and undid the straps around his bracer, setting the curved composite plate on the table and showing his forearm to Ash.
Believe it or not, I actually started out working for the Elite Four,
Giovanni said, displaying the faded tattoo depicting 4 swords pointing outwards to Ash.
I was a ranger assigned to escorting Professor Oak to the new town of Pallet and guarding him while he was there when I met your mother. The results of that excursion should be obvious. That was back when tension between Kanto and Johto were running extremely high thanks to the Elite Four, all of whom but Lance were from Kanto, siding with Cinnabar over Johto in a dispute over territory. When he learned that several Jotan cities had decided to secede, Lance created a secret organization to carry out black operation inside Johto to assassinate the rebel leaders and quell the unrest. Team Rocket was born. And he picked you to lead it,
Ash guessed.
It started out as a single squad of assassins and a minimal financial base under my command,
Giovanni nodded.
We were small, but we were good. A year after we started, every rebel leader had been quietly bribed, blackmailed, or otherwise dealt with, and Team Rocket's mission changed. We were reorganized to a trans-regional charity service, providing humanitarian aid wherever it was needed. That, of course, let us go anywhere to act as Lance's enforcers. Whenever anyone got too ambitious, we were there to maintain the status quo. No fucking way,
Ash leaned forward, scowling harshly.
You're trying to convince me that everything you do is sanctioned by the Elite Four? That's...
He stopped and thought for a second.
That's beyond stupid.
It's the truth, said the man in the suit.
With people like Professors Oak, Elm, Rowan, and Birch running around free, each one a walking army working for their own agendas and causing all kinds of havoc, Lance knew he couldn't afford to not have a shadow organization to keep the peace at all costs. Which changed when?
Ash asked.
When did Team Rocket go from maintaining the peace to sucking entire cities dry and starting wars? About the same time that the professors stopped fighting,
Giovanni answered, interlacing his fingers in front of his face and resting his chin on his knuckles.
Once Oak and Bill lead the charge for peace with their colleagues, threats to the Elite Four's rule started coming out of the woodwork. Political strife and old vendettas flared in Johto. War broke out in Hoenn and threatened to spread. Or's ruling elite began mustering armies and building fleets and, we learned at great cost, planning to invade southern Kanto, Johto, and Cinnabar. A populist movement in the Orange Islands ousted the king and replaced him with parliament of expansionist warmongers who wanted nothing more than to acquire Cinnabar, which had just signed a treaty of alliance with the Elite Four. Ash, the world's political face completely changed in less than a decade. Team Rocket was stretched to capacity just trying to control the flow of information around the mainland, much less follow our orders to disrupt Or's plans, destabilize the Orange Islands from within, and again quell the unrest in Johto. We needed resources that Lance couldn't just give to us. And I needed to protect my family.
Sitting silently, Ash stared across the table and studied Giovanni's face for a long minute, scrutinizing every detail for the tell of a lie.
And?
He probed.
My job didn't make me many friends,
said the man in the suit,
and I was already spending twice as much time away from home as not, so I told your mother what I was doing, and made her promise to stay close to her father for protection and to protect you. Then I left. I didn't want my business threatening either of you.
His jaw clenching, Ash suddenly found it difficult to breathe.
I don't think I believe that,
he managed to say.
Ever since, I worked to put out fires and keep Team Rocket funded,
Giovanni went on.
When I learned Pallet had been destroyed, I was working in Mount Moon to get a new facility up and running. When I sent men to Pallet and didn't find anyone, I assumed the worst. Then you show up in the mountains and I... That's not how it happened,
Ash interrupted, his face hot.
Jesse and James tried to recruit me in Viridian. You had to know after that.
Shaking his head, Giovanni set his hands on the table.
At that point Jesse and James were working under one of my subordinates, he said. They didn't report directly to me. When they reported to their administrator that you were working with Misty, who had been a constant threat to our operations in Cerulean since her departure, he decided you were a threat and ordered them to bring you in and kill Misty if at all possible. They tried to kill me too, you know,
Ash barked.
Their orders were to capture you,
Giovanni retorted.
And I still didn't even know you were alive until I saw you with my own eyes in Mount Moon.
Ash stopped short.
You were in Mount Moon? Why didn't I see you? Because I hid. Put yourself in my place,
said the man in the suit, leaning forward.
I had absolutely no clue what was going on. To complicate matters, you were working directly with one of my avowed enemies, and on top of that I had already delayed a vital mission into Johto to stop all this.
He waved his hand around.
And I had to leave immediately. Just leaving orders with my subordinate administrator that you were to remain unharmed took more time than I could afford. Remain unharmed.
Ash's voice grew nearly to a shout.
Is this a joke? They tried to kill me. Over and over and over. And I know that now,
Giovanni said, his tone easy as he raised his hands defensively.
But when I left I was in the dark, trusting that my orders would be obeyed. Jesse's and James' administrator assumed, rightly, that I meant to give you a position of authority within the organization. She felt threatened, and decided to kill you while I was away and couldn't do anything. You were gone an awfully long time,
Ash snapped.
I didn't mean to be,
answered the man on the other side of the table.
I wanted to come back and talk to you but I knew that if I did the mission in Johto would fail. In retrospect, I might as well have pulled out earlier.
He muttered the last part.
Regardless of that and for what it's worth, that particular administrator has been dealt with. On a completely unrelated note, I'm also looking to fill her position. Nope,
Ash held up his hands.
Let me stop you right there. As recently as Celadon and Saffron, Jesse and James were trying to kill me.
He stopped and reflected for a second.
James less so in Saffron, but still. Jessie was insane,
Giovanni laughed hollowly.
She was a ruthless killing machine whose only loyalty was to her own urges. I expect she tried harder than James to do you any real harm. For all that however, James still cared deeply for her, so when she died in Celadon I expect it drove him over the edge and he stopped caring about orders. Wait,
Ash looked up.
James told me Jessie was still alive. When we fought in Sylph he said Jessie had escaped.
A perplexed look crossed Giovanni's face, followed immediately by realization.
That lends itself to my theory that James finally cracked, he said. How do you figure? Jessie was killed in Celadon,
the man in the suit stated flatly.
She went without orders and died in the fighting. She finally snapped, I believe, and James went off the deep end shortly thereafter. Between my ordering him to bring you in and his arrival in Saffron, I expect. Why?
Ash blurted, slapping his palms on the polished table.
Why would you even keep people like that around?
Giovanni shrugged.
I needed people who were good at killing. So you send them to recruit for you? Not normally, no. But when I did, the potential recruit wasn't normally someone traveling with one of my enemies. Well, I've had enough of everyone and their brother trying to get me to join their clubs.
Ash shook his head, contempt plain on his features.
Forget it. I wouldn't presume to expect you to join anyway, said Giovanni. What I would risk to hope, is that I could enlist your help against a common enemy. Mewtwo, I expect,
Ash muttered. Giovanni nodded, the quiet hum of the lights quickly becoming the loudest sound in the room. Thinking, Ash looked across the table, past his father and at the bright, if skewed, reflection of the room glinting at him in the polished stone wall.
You still haven't given me any evidence that he's my enemy. In fact.
Ash looked back at the man in the suit.
He's done more for me than you ever have.
Again the room went silent as Giovanni blinked and glanced away, leaving Ash to smugly fold his arms in front of his chest. The young gym leader mentally congratulated himself on the well-timed insult, though a moment later May's words again crept into his thoughts. Again guilt gnawed into Ash's stomach and he leaned forward a little, formulating a way to move the conversation along.
He's gathering an army,
Giovanni beat Ash to speaking first.
Mewtwo's calling monsters from all throughout the deep roads to his lair in Malbolge at the bottom of Cerulean Cave. The Elite Force Rangers know for a fact that the lower levels are teeming with monsters, waiting rather than fighting each other. Mewtwo's waiting for an opportune time to attack and he knows he has some time left to decide on a moment. because no one who knows about him wants to tell the Elite Four. But he also knows that eventually Blaine and I will have to tell Lance about him and suffer the consequences, at which point all hands will be forced and the chips will just fall where they will. You can keep telling me Mewtwo's the enemy,
Ash said, laying his hands palms up on the table.
If you want me to believe you, I need hard evidence. I need someone else to confirm your story. Then let me prove it to you,
Giovanni said.
Blaine will back me up on everything. If that's not enough, then follow me to Saffron or Indigo and talk with Lance.
A cold pang shot through Ash's chest at the idea.
Because Lance will just sit down and tell me about all the secret operations he's been behind for decades.
A hint of sarcasm colored Ash's words.
If I ask him to, yes,
Giovanni answered, his tone deadly serious.
And let me throw this in. You give me 1 month, just 1 month to prove that everything I've said is the truth, and I'll pay for Janine's Huntington's treatments. All expenses, no questions asked, I'll take care of it if you let me prove I'm telling you the truth.
Ash raised an eyebrow, keeping his features even, despite his increased heart rate.
Wow,
he muttered.
I didn't exactly see that coming. The two of you seem close,
Giovanni stated.
You've been traveling together for a while, so you must be aware of her condition by now.
Ash nodded.
I've known for a while, yeah. Then you also know that hers will be a very difficult and unpleasant end. She'll literally wither into a mad husk and die.
Ash swallowed the lump that formed in his throat and tried to ignore the cold sweat that broke out on his forehead.
That too,
he said.
So you should also be aware that the cure is experimental, and extremely expensive. It'll eat up more resources than most people would be willing to spend on a single person. Most people doesn't include you,
Ash sighed.
Does it? No,
Giovanni nodded.
It doesn't. So,
muttered the younger gym leader,
1 month working for you, and you'll get her taken care of.
Ash's face grew redder as a single drop of sweat dripped from his chin.
I'm not even asking you to work for me,
said the man in the suit.
I want you to work with me.
His eyes flitting from side to side, Ash weighed the offer.
Why?
he asked.
Why such a good deal? Well,
Giovanni shifted in his seat, folding his arms and then uncrossing them again in the delay that followed.
I haven't been the best.
He stopped.
I thought I could make up for.
He paused again.
You're all I have left.
He said quickly.
And I'm not too proud to admit that I've made a lot of mistakes, the biggest of which was being a shitty father.
Ash could only stare for a moment, his jaw going a little slack.
What? That's it,
Giovanni added, opening his hands and shrugging.
I'd like a chance to make up for a few things. No ulterior motive?
Ash asked, his face washed over with bafflement.
You feel guilty and want me to like you. You're my son,
said Giovanni, his voice unsteady despite the calm in his features.
And I haven't even.
He stopped. Ash stood up and began walking for the door.
I'm going to get something to eat,
he said, not meeting his father's eye.
Think about it,
Giovanni called after him as Ash stepped into the hall.
My offer stands, but I've got to leave as soon as I hear from Lance.
Ash paused for only a second before shutting the door behind him and hustling down the hall.
No, 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 no,
he muttered over and over again.
I'm not going to do anything for that bastard. I'm not going to help him or even.
He rounded a bend and stopped in the empty stairwell. His shoulders shaking, Ash leaned one arm against the stone wall, breathing quickly.
I'm not.
He shouted.
I hate him.
He whirled around and slammed his fist into the wall, filling the tower with a dull thud. Jaw clenched tight, Ash left his twitching fist against the wall for a second as his words echoed back at him. Slowly, he drew his hand to his chest and cradled it there.
Ouch,
he muttered. Calmer now, at least ostensibly, Ash began walking down the spiraling tower, wrapped in thought, until he instinctively stopped at a door and exited into another hall. Following that a ways, he found himself waiting in a sparsely furnished sitting area stacked high with boxes and crates of supplies. Several minutes passed and one of the doors along the side of the room opened up and Ash looked over, spotting Janine immediately as she walked from a brightly lit room. Getting to his feet, Ash smiled and walked over to her, only noticing as he neared the utter lack of color in the girl's features.
Hey,
he said stepping up beside her. As if snapping from a trance, Janine turned to Ash and grinned weakly.
Oh,
she said.
Hey, yourself. What's up? I was just looking for you, actually,
he said.
Good news.
Janine's smile faded some, she reached over and took Ash's hand. Ash glanced around, ensuring their privacy, then looked at the closed door behind Janine before turning his attention back to her.
Well, not really,
he said.
What happened?
Janine asked, the last remnants of color draining from her face. Putting one hand behind his head, Ash steeled himself and straightened up.
I was talking to Giovanni and,
he paused,
and part of me thinks I might have gotten some things backwards. I really don't want to admit it, but I think siding with him might be the way to go. For the moment.
He stopped as Janine's eyes widened and her jaw dropped open some.
What are you saying?
She asked, voice shaking.
He said he'd be willing to help you.
Ash took Janine's other hand, his grip unsteady.
He said he'd pay to get you better.
Without a word, Janine jerked her hands from Ash's and stepped back, her face going hard.
Wait,
Ash said.
I know it sounds bad, but it'd be for you. He'd help.
Before the young trainer could blink, Janine spun and slapped him squarely across the face with the back of her hand. Ash staggered for a second and almost tripped from the blow.
No,
Janine said in a trembling voice.
No Ash, I think I might have gotten you backwards. Wait.
Ash reached out for her as Janine turned to walk away.
What's the matter?
Janine again jerked her wrist from his hand and spun away from Ash, stopping several paces away and staring at him with glistening eyes as her features shook.
You're the same as him,
Janine hissed through clenched teeth.
You and Koga, you're both the same.
She shouted, darting away.
Wait.
Ash called after her and running in the direction she had bolted.
Janine, don't go. Please.
He rounded a corner and froze, having lost sight of the girl in purple. He stood there for several seconds, his brain trying to wrap itself around what had happened. After some time, he drooped against the wall and stared at the ground, muttering to himself as his eyes watered.
What did I do?
He whispered, turning and shuffling down the hall. Sitting on the floor with his back against the granite wall, Ash could only sigh and rest his elbows on his knees. For what felt like a long time, he stared at his palms and let his mind go idle. All around him he could hear the sounds of Blaine's impromptu field hospital. Wounded soldiers groaned, medics called for supplies, Pokemon in the middle of treatment growled and yipped in pain, and flies buzzed around the living and the dead alike. Several times Ash tried to shake himself from his stupor, to no avail. Fingers beginning to shake, the young gym leader realized he hadn't relaxed at all since seeing Giovanni for the first time in years. Every muscle in the young man's body ached from the tension, but try as he might, Ash couldn't bring himself to relax. Every breath bound him tighter, bringing less relief than the one before it.
Shit,
Ash gasped hard, realizing he had begun to sweat and grow cold.
Help me,
he muttered, barely audible. He took several fast deep breaths, exhaling and breathing in again before the previous breath could steady him and growing increasingly numb in the process as his arms bunched up involuntarily before him.
Somebody!
He burst out, doubling over and clutching at his chest, every heartbeat threatening to rip his skin away from his muscles.
Help me!
A pair of footsteps rushed up to Ash's side as the young trainer stared at the floor. His pupils dilated and contracted wildly as he gasped faster and harder, sweat pouring from his face as his skin turned red.
Hey, this is that gym leader from Kanto,
a deep voice called as Ash felt hands under his armpits.
Get a doc over here.
Thoughts raced into Ash's mind, only to stick in the tar-like fog clouding his senses and further clutter his faculties. He could feel strong arms lifting him to his feet and Ash tried to walk in the direction he was led, but his legs refused to do more than shuffle helplessly and the young gym leader froze, locking his eyes shut as his gut clenched up and churned. For time he couldn't judge, Ash felt movement around him as he tried only to breathe. Each gasp for air came harder and faster from his chest, relieving none of the burning or the dizziness swimming in his head. A sudden change in equilibrium told Ash he now lay on his back. Instantly his eyes snapped open and he searched for the threat that had pinned him, only to see two faces hovering over him against the backdrop of a brown ceiling.
Need you to slow your breathing,
said the woman with short blonde hair as she held Ash's arms against his chest. Her words began to phase in and out as his head spun.
Going, get you out, armor.
Ash nodded, that much registering. He tried desperately to spread his arms, to make it easier for the doctors to help, but the paralysis held him firmly in a fetal position. He gasped a curse, again sinking his eyes shut in stark terror, unable to understand what was happening.
Hyperventilating,
said the woman again.
Slowly, in and count to 5, out for 5 seconds.
Ash fought to do as he was told, but the panic shredding his mind fought back. For more time, he kept his eyes shut and could only focus on bringing air into his lungs as his body seemingly tried to strangle him. He realized abruptly that his missing pauldrons and elbow guards left his arms exposed, and he heard the doctor warning him of a coming pinch only an instant before pain lanced his arm.
A compound to get you calm,
said the doctor reassuringly as Ash opened his eyes.
We need to get you hydrated too.
The woman looked at him without worry in her features.
Still with us?
Ash nodded, watching the pretty woman's eyes as the burly nurse in his periphery hung a bag of fluid from a metal pole. The young gym leader focused his efforts solely on breathing slowly and, over the next several minutes as the doctor again and again counted down the seconds before he should exhale, Ash began to feel warmth return to his limbs. He quickly noticed the several blankets that had appeared over him.
Better?
Asked the doctor. Waiting for a second while his thoughts continued swimming, Ash nodded.
What's wrong?
He forced himself to breathe again.
With me? You're having a pretty bad panic attack,
said the woman, patting his shoulder and leaning over him.
I don't panic,
Ash shook his head.
I don't let myself panic. Sometimes you don't have a say in the matter, plus you were extremely dehydrated which didn't help,
she went on.
I know it seems rough, but you're going to be okay. We see this a lot in soldiers right after an intense engagement. Trust me, we're going to take good care of you. All you need to do is rest up.
She stopped mid-sentence and turned as someone elsewhere called her name and a scream filled the room.
I'm fine,
Ash insisted, still out of breath but drawing the doctor's attention for another second.
Go help.
She patted his arm.
Try to sleep.
She got up and briskly walked across the room as a man with his legs snapped backwards was carried in. Glancing around and finding a clock, Ash read the time and watched lethargically as an hour slipped by. His breathing evened out as the fluid in the bag hanging over him dripped through the tube stuck to his arm. The dusty burned orange light filtering into the room dimmed a little as sunset neared and Ash began becoming more aware of his surroundings, quickly prompting him to try to tune them out again. The sounds of the wounded formed a constant murmur even during the rare moments when someone wasn't shouting.
Glad you made it out.
The voice drew Ash's attention and the young gym leader turned to see two men, boys really, sitting against the nearby wall and talking. One had a bandage covering up his forehead and right eye, while the second one sat apparently unhurt aside from an angry red scratch across his face.
How you holding up?
Asked the one with the bad eye, nudging the boy beside him. The second boy started, sitting with his elbows on his knees. He ran a hand through his matted brown hair, scraping some of the brownish-red residue from his scalp. Not answering, he began picking at the hair on his forearms and running his palms over his knees.
You okay?
Asked the first. Eyes locked intently on the ground, the second boy began fidgeting with his camouflaged sleeves and tugging at the rough material.
I killed someone out there,
he said, pausing for a second thereafter.
They just ran at me in the trenches. I just did.
Both sat in silence for several minutes until the first spoke again.
How'd it feel?
He asked. Chin quivering a little, the second boy ran a finger over the scratch on his cheek.
Dirty,
he said, breath catching. For a moment he pawed at his face with one hand, features beginning to shake.
Can I go home now?
He looked at his friend.
Can I just go home please?
Ash turned away and refused to listen. Shaking his head once, he sat up in the bed and without a thought pulled the needle from his arm. Scanning the room, he saw that all of the doctors had been completely absorbed into treating a fresh wave of badly wounded soldiers brought in on their comrades' shoulders. The young gym leader pulled on his shirt and stood up, grabbing his armor and walking towards the exit, unnoticed. Pulling the protective plates back over his frame and feeling far less naked thereafter, Ash wandered the halls of the gym. Had he been fully himself he might have marveled at the way the rooms and passages had been carved from solid rock, the tall and narrow windows and skylights fortified with tremendous metal bars. None of the beauty of the granite halls impressed him however. Face as blank as his mind, Ash simply walked until he realized by the warm air blowing into his face came that he had stepped outside. Jaw going a little slack, Ash swallowed hard and put one hand on his stomach as if to hold back the nausea. Before him stretched the 100 yards of blasted earth, burned black in more places than not and torn up in hundreds craters. At the end of the no man's land Ash saw the beginning of the Jotun's earthworks, the first massive wall of dirt rose up like a city's wall to protect the trenches beyond that now burned with fires whose plumes of smoke completely obscured the sky beyond the fortifications. Almost as numerous as the craters pockmarking the no-man's land, the bodies of humans and Pokémon dotted the field between the gym and the trenches. Reaching over the dull roar of the fires in the distance, the cries and moanings of the wounded permeated the air. Standing absolutely still and unable to do anything more than take in the scene, Ash watched as men in uniforms and armor walked amongst the field, checking bodies and searching for the crying survivors. When one man found another alive, he'd call for help and with the aid of another soldier, should one be available, carry the wounded man back towards the gym. As the minutes rolled by, the procession of troopers passing by him gradually pulled Ash back to his senses and he stumbled towards the field, drawn by the sight of several men in black armor carrying bodies from the edge of the trench's earthen wall towards a smaller portion of the field.
"Captain,"
Ash called, spotting Zivika standing and observing the activities of his troopers.
"Ash,"
said the soldier, turning to greet the younger trainer.
"Something I can do for you?"
he asked when Ash neared.
"I was wondering if there was something I could do to help out around here."
The young gym leader spotted around, noting that most of the trainers walking around hailed from the captain's dragon company and carried the bodies of dead men towards a particularly large crater. Zivika turned his attention back on the activity of his men.
"I think we've got it under control,"
he said, his tone uncharacteristically hollow.
"Thank you though."
Watching for a second as the trainers in black carried the bodies to the crater and heaved them over the edge, then went back to the trenches for another load, Ash stood as quietly as the several men standing at the edge of the crater waited with shovels at the ready.
"Those aren't Cinnabarian bodies,"
he stated, pausing until Zivika nodded.
"Why bury them at all?"
he asked. The captain sighed and motioned with one hand, a string of beads twined between his fingers, for Ash to follow him. Silently he led Ash to the crater and stopped beside the dozen or so troopers waiting with shovels, pointing for Ash to look over the shallow hole in the land and the corpses lining its floor.
"You'll see," said the captain, "that they're all dead. Some of my men disagree, but I see no difference between two dead bodies, regardless of who they were before their end."
Close enough that he could quite easily make out the features of many of the men's faces, Ash again put his hand over his stomach.
"That still doesn't explain why you're bothering," he said. "If you're worried about disease, fire would take care of that."
He motioned to the flames still burning in the nearby trenches.
"It'd be a lot faster too." "That's not the point,"
Zivika answered. He stepped forward and Ash followed him without comment.
"Most Jotuns believe that a body has to be buried for the soul to reach the afterlife. And you're honoring that belief?"
Ash asked.
"Awfully charitable of you. It makes me feel better."
Stopping in front of one of the bodies, Zivika put his foot on its shoulder and rolled the dead soldier onto his back. The Jotun, eyes somewhere between closed and half open, must have met his end at the hands of an especially powerful electrical attack, Ash guessed after seeing the gaping cavity blown in the chest and noting the singed flesh around the edges of the hole.
"No ID tags,"
muttered the captain, the buzzing of flies and the burning of fires providing the only other sounds in the fast-waning evening light.
"I wonder what his name was."
For a moment longer he looked over the corpse's strikingly young features.
"He looks like someone from Olivine. And they marry young around there, so I wonder too if he had a wife. I wonder how she'll get along without him. I wonder if he had children who'll come and avenge him, and who will come to avenge them should they die attacking my home. More than anything though,"
Zivika went on,
"I wonder why we can't just leave each other alone."
Ash looked away from the body, then walked back to the edge of the crater and looked towards the gym without speaking. Zivika joined him a moment later and the two warriors looked out over the field towards the west as the sun dipped a little farther than halfway behind the horizon.
"I don't know how much more of this I can take,"
Ash muttered.
"I've been fighting my entire life, but I've never..."
He paused again.
"I've never seen anything on this scale before. How do you do it?"
He turned to the older soldier.
"How do I cope?"
Zivika clarified, going on when Ash nodded.
"I go home when it's all over, hug my son and hold my daughters like I'll never let her go, then tuck my grandkids into bed and pray for peace for their sakes." "Must be nice,"
Ash muttered.
"Pretty much everyone I've ever cared about is dead or hates my guts. Seems like fighting is all I have left."
He smiled weakly.
"Guess it's a good thing I'm good at it." "Along those lines,"
Zivika said.
"Once this is over..."
He waved his hand, looking at the field before him.
"Johto, Orange, and Or will have retribution coming their way. You can bet Command is going to make them pay for this, and we're going to need talented soldiers for the effort. Now your grandmother, Barshabatha's daughter actually, was a Cinnabarian citizen and by extension so was your mom and so are you. If you wanted to it would take about 10 minutes and a few signed papers to have you your full citizenship and a commission in the Air Force."
Ash raised an eyebrow.
What was that about my mother?
He asked. Zivika smirked.
It's pretty common knowledge that Professor Oak flew in here a few decades back and swept a certain general's daughter off her feet. It's also common knowledge that they had a daughter who never renounced the citizenship she inherited from her mother. I know you've probably had your belly full of fighting for a while, but if it's family you're looking for, Cinnabar would be glad to welcome home the champion son who killed Elm. Technically, May killed Elm.
Ash cleared his throat.
She wasn't Cinnabarian,
Zivika smirked.
Doesn't count.
Ash couldn't hold back a grin.
I've been thinking for a while that it might be time for me to just pick a side, right or wrong, and be done with it. That way at least someone wouldn't be trying to kill me.
He stopped as he looked towards the mountain into which Blaine had built his gym. The young trainer's gaze moved of its own accord to the rookery where he had landed with Giovanni. From this distance any detail was impossible to make out, but Ash knew without even seeing her that a girl in a purple hoodie sat at the edge of the rookery's massive doors. Reaching to his belt, Ash grabbed a Pokéball.
Hey, thanks for the talk. I might take you up on the offer sometime, but right now there's someone else I need to go see.
He released Pidgeot from her Pokéball and stepped back as the massive bird stretched. Greeting her with a scratch through her crest, Ash hopped in the Pokémon's saddle.
Sure thing,
Zivika said.
Hey, my men and I are flying out in the morning to help hold the river. If we don't see you before then, good luck out there kid.
Ash inclined his head a little and tapped his heels into Pidgeot's sides. The massive bird hopped forward and threw herself into the air with a chirp, carrying Ash skywards at a speed that briefly blurred the edges of his vision. In no time Ash and Pidgeot had leveled off and coasted lazily towards the open doors of the rookery where Ash could plainly make out the girl sitting with her head and shoulder against one wall and her legs dangling off the edge of the stone platform overlooking the island. A moment later the bird and her trainer landed in the rookery, and Ash dismounted. Running his hand through Pidgeot's feathers for a moment, Ash tried to glimpse Janine from the corner of his eye without making the gesture too awkward. After a brief moment of straining one eye, he sighed, walked away from Pidgeot, plopped himself down on the platform next to the girl and dangled his feet over the sheer drop.
Hey,
the young gym leader looked over at the girl next to him, trying to read the sullen look on her face.
Hey,
Janine answered without moving or looking at Ash, her features remaining sober.
I'm sorry about the slap.
Putting a hand on his cheek, the skin stinging from the memory alone, Ash looked away as the wind picked up and made his eyes sting.
Don't mention it,
he said. A moment later the two again sat in silence, Ash staring out over the darkening landscape and towards the waning sunset, Janine at the little lines running through the stone against which she leaned her head.
So I'm sorry for what I said,
Ash blurted.
I didn't mean to upset you, I was just happy that I thought I had found a way to help you out.
Janine shook her head, eyes watering.
Don't apologize,
she said, her hands beginning to tremble. Immediately the girl clenched her fists together and shoved her hands into her lap to keep them still, threatening the balance that kept her perched on the platform.
Please don't. It wasn't anything you said.
For several long seconds her arms shook, the trembling slowly migrating into her shoulders and neck.
Damn it,
she hissed through clenched teeth, staring at her shaking hands.
It's worse than ever.
Without permission or a single word, Ash stood up and reached out, putting one hand under Janine's knees and wrapping the other around her back. For a second she resisted, but as he carried her away from the edge of the platform the girl simply closed her eyes and bit her lip as Ash sat down at a safe distance from the edge and leaned her against him.
Remember back in Fuchsia?
Ash said after a moment when Janine's trembling had settled down.
When I told you you could talk to me about anything? You still can, and I'll help however I can.
Letting go with a sigh, little tremors still rocking her, Janine opened her eyes but looked away.
It's getting worse,
she said, her voice almost lost in the rushing of the wind blowing through the rookery.
I had doubled up on the meds and it didn't help. Now I'm out and...
She looked down at her twitching fingers.
Now I'm out and it...
Her breathing grew labored.
Ash, I don't want to go this way. I can feel it creeping up on me and I don't want to die like this. So let me help.
Ash swallowed the lump in his throat and pushed the bile from his mind.
I don't like them either, but Team Rocket are willing to get blamed to help you.
He held her a little closer and tried to smile reassuringly.
If putting up with them for a little while gets you better then I'd call that a small price to pay.
Janine remained silent and looked away, though she in no way resisted when Ash kissed the top of her head.
Please.
Ash said, voice a little uneasy.
I'd really like it if you could stick round. It's not some magic antidote.
Janine snapped, pushing herself up and away from Ash in a sudden fit, leaving the younger gym leader sitting bewildered. She glared down at him, void of her usual poise, her whole frame twitching.
The treatments are as risky as the disease.
She went on, voice trembling and rising.
We're talking about injecting me with so many different viruses and chemicals that pretty much every gene in my body, my whole genetic makeup, unwinds like a ball of yarn. Then I have to trust germs, disgusting little things that aren't even alive that were built by a madman to put me, who I am, back together. What could possibly go wrong there? Oh, and did I mention that the whole process is so excruciating that I literally have to be in an induced coma to blot out the pain?
Ash! Janine screamed, grabbing fistfuls of her hair as tears began dripping down her face and little unconscious jerks made her tug at her own scalp.
There's a good chance, almost 50-50, that the initial stages of the month long.
She emphasized the two words with a chaotic wave of her hand.
Treatment will out and out kill me or cook my brain. That's not even getting into the rehab.
She hung her head in her hands and heaved a deep breath mixed with an exasperated scream, then dropped her shoulders and let her hands fall by her sides as Ash stood up.
It might just be easier to die and get it over with,
Janine whimpered, shakily standing there as Ash walked forward and put his arms around her.
So easy.
She muttered, a hollow, exhausted smile on her face.
Just over to the edge, jump, whoosh, splat. That would be it, no more worries. You can't imagine how good it feels right now.
She opened her eyes a little, to think that way. Holding her a little tighter, Ash stared out over the platform a few paces away as the last sliver of the sun dipped behind the horizon.
Right after the battle in Celadon,
he muttered, beginning to shake a little himself.
With everything I had put up with, I was so tired. When I left Brock I planned on marching straight into Saffron and murdering every rocket agent I found until the city was rid of them or I was dead. If I survived that I was going to head to Viridian City and hit them there. If I survived that I was going to make for Indigo and hit them there too, since I doubted the Elite Four would look kindly on my tearing their city to shreds and openly attacking people. I like to think I hid my intentions pretty well.
Ash smirked a little, before sniffing hard to fight back tears.
But then you came out of nowhere.
He paused,
and something told me not to go through with it. Janine.
He whispered, chest tight.
I really don't want you to go.
Ash felt Janine's arms wrap around his back as she embraced him. A small hiccup of a sob escaped her throat and Ash could feel tears on his neck as the girl buried her face in his collar.
I'm tired of living with this.
Janine could barely mouth the words, forcing herself to breathe them audibly.
I'm sick of being alone with it. Then be with me instead.
Ash stroked her hair.
I'd never leave you.
Janine broke down and sobbed into Ash's shoulder, wrapping Ash in an embrace so tight he staggered for breath. Recovering, he held Janine steady as her legs gave out and she slumped against him.
Okay,
the girl choked.
Promise you won't leave. I promise,
Ash said, his voice trembling.
You brought me back to life. I promise I'll never leave.
He paused.
But that goes for you too.
Ash smiled at her, pulling back just a little.
You don't get to leave me either.
Face streaked with wet lines, Janine reached up and drew her sleeve across her eyes.
Deal,
she said.
So much for not leaving,
Janine smiled, holding Ash's hand in a white-knuckled grip. Her breathing came in quick but deep draws as she sat, submerged up to her waist in an open tank of dully luminescent fluid.
This isn't leaving,
Ash smiled back at her, his voice trembling as much as hers. He gave her hand a reassuring squeeze.
This is just a temporary.
He searched for a word.
Disjunction.
Janine offered.
Yeah,
Ash quickly accepted.
Anyway.
He went on.
From your perspective this is going to be no time at all. You'll take a quick nap, wake up, and I'll be waiting right here for you. Sound good?
Goosebumps covering her bare arms and legs, Janine nodded, the motion shaking the wires attached to the little pads stuck to her forehead and shoulders. The dull hum of the lights overhead filled the laboratory for a second as Ash knelt by the metal tank and ran his hand up and down Janine's arm. Blaine stepped forward from the side of the room and began maneuvering a small cart laden with instruments and supplies into position next to his patient.
You'll be in the care of my most skilled technicians,
said the man in the lab coat as he took a clear mask and slipped it over Janine's nose and mouth, attaching the plastic tube to a device on the cart.
Your chances really couldn't be better.
Thanks, Janine shivered, her voice muted by the mask. She watched without a flinch as Blaine took an 4 from the cart, slipped it into her arm without hesitation, and gently strapped it to her with a plastic restraint. She looked back at Ash, eyes wide as Blaine repeated the process on her other arm, and again on her thighs until had half a dozen little tubes running from her frame to a number of devices on the cart. Finally, Blaine clamped a small instrument to her finger and a monitor on the cart began beeping at a feverish pace.
This first wave is going to knock you out,
Blaine said calmly, putting his hand on Janine's shoulder and helping her ease into the fluid till she lay flat on her back in the tank.
Try to relax. It should help the process along.
He reached over and pushed a button on one of the machines.
Count backwards from 20, please.
Janine turned her head, looking over at Ash. She mouthed words silenced by the fluid to him and he smiled. He whispered something back to her, giving her hand another squeeze. A second later, her grip on his fingers went slack, and Ash carefully set her arm down in the tank as the beeping from the monitor grew slower and steadier. He reached up and wiped his eye, then stood up.
She's going to be all right, right?
He asked, turning to Blaine, his fists clenched and his face like stone. Scratching his mustache with one hand, Blaine patted Ash's shoulder.
The odds of her living are better than the odds of the alternative.
The man in the white coat turned to the two technicians standing quietly in the corner of the laboratory. He nodded and the two men walked up to the tank and began looking over instruments and running lines of plastic tubing from the machines on the cart to ports in the walls as Ash watched with a glassy look in his eye.
Come on,
Blaine said, moving Ash towards the door.
We were out of time several hours ago.
Stepping into the dim hall beyond the brightly lit laboratory, Ash and Blaine stopped as Giovanni stepped out of the shadows.
So the meeting is on?
Asked Blaine. Giovanni nodded, hiking up the collar of his tailored jacket.
Saffron. Lance will meet us at Sabrina's gym. Very good.
Blaine nodded his approval, glancing between Ash and the older trainer as Giovanni slipped his hands in his pockets.
I'll meet you in the rookery,
he said, setting off down the hall. After he had gone, Giovanni put a hand on Ash's shoulder.
You both made the right call,
he said, his tone as comforting as he could make it.
She's in good hands and you're to thank for it.
Ash nodded, then shook his head.
Thanks,
he said.
Listen,
said the man in the suit.
I know you've got to be stressed, but you did the right thing, and that's what counts. You'll see. I'm trying really hard not to feel like a sellout,
Ash muttered.
I go from fighting Team Rocket, to working with you. If that's not losing direction. You know the feeling.
Giovanni nodded.
All too well. If it's direction you want though, let me offer you some.
He paused and a small grin crossed his lips.
Have you ever heard of the Sun Soul?
End of chapter.